War and Revolution, section, from the denunciation of Bolshevism to the liquidation of Jacobinism and the French Revolution. We are far removed from the cultural and political climate of revisionism. It is therefore appropriate to take a quick look at the stages via which it was created. A few years after The Origins of Totalitarianism, an American historian undertook to reconstruct as a unitary phenomenon the revolutionary cycle that developed on both sides of the Atlantic, and in particular in America and France. While its key moment was the revolt of the British colonies, of which the upheavals in France were to be regarded as a mere consequence, this, quote, Western Revolution, which created Western and, quote, Atlantic civilization, excluded neither Rousseau nor Robespierre, who were the first to confer a positive meaning on the term democracy, and to theorize a democratic state based on the principle of political equality. Likewise, essentially positive was Palmer's estimate of Toussaint Louverture, the black Jacobin who led the Great Slave Revolt in San Domingo, which was also to be situated in the ambit of the, quote, Western Revolution. Beginning of long quote. Struggling against chaos, against breakdown in labor, production, and government, in a turmoil of strife between rivals, and between mulattoes and Negroes, with threats of Spanish and British intervention, and in fear of a reimposition of slavery, Toussaint managed to maintain a regime whose stated ideals, at least, were those of the European Revolution, at the cost of atrocities that were worse than those of the Vendée or Ireland. End of long quote. From this rapid comparative overview, it emerges that violence and terror are not attributable exclusively to Jacobinism. In fact, Britain was no stranger to the phenomenon. Conventional representations of the revolution across the Atlantic likewise involve excluding the struggle with the Loyalists from the historical picture. It was so bitter that in 1776 America seemed to presage, quote, something of the gouvernement révolutionnaire, and even the terror of France in 1793. End quote. Certainly, there were differences of scale and intensity, which are not a priori deducible from ideology. The greater or lesser bitterness of the struggle primarily derived from the concrete situation. While the French émigrés returned home, their American counterparts, quote, peopled the Canadian wilderness. As with the author of The Origins of Totalitarianism, Britain remained synonymous with reaction in Palmer. There, the aristocracy, which controlled both houses of Parliament, severely repressed, quote, agitation for parliamentary reform and movements for democracy. While it conjoined America and France, the Western Revolution thus found Burke's native land and Burke himself in opposition. Compared with Arendt, Palmer's novelty consists in his dichotomy between the revolution of the Western world, which occurred in the 18th century in advanced countries, and that of the non-Western world, which occurred in the 20th century in as-yet backward countries. Where the former had occurred, there was little or no room for the latter. Having broken out in the 18th century, the French Revolution was bound up with other movements of its own time within the area of Western civilization, not, quote, modern communism. Constructed thus, the dichotomy abolishes the distinction between Lenin's revolutionary dictatorship and Stalin's totalitarianism, and condemns the October Revolution, totally excluded from the West from the outset. However, reference to the theme of slavery ends up problematizing the configuration and confines of the Western Revolution. The black Jacobin, Toussaint Louverture, sought to found a free republic that might prove acceptable to some European republicans in these years, but not to their American counterparts. By contrast, the white colonists appealed to the example of the USA and the southern states. They regarded their liberal or democratic professions of faith and defense of the institution of slavery as perfectly compatible, and, in their dispute with the abolitionists, threatened secession from France and adhesion to the North American Republic. Around 1790, San Domingo was the site of, quote, the first great shock between the ideals of white supremacy and race equality. In asserting this, Palmer cites a text of 1914 by T. Lothrop Stoddard, theoretician of white supremacy, who a few years later denounced the October Revolution as a further stage in the revolt of peoples of color against civilization. With the preeminence he accorded to the revolt of the British colonies, Palmer provoked critical reactions from Marxist and even Jacobin-inspired historiography. Even more serious, however, are the reservations elicited on the other side by a category like Western Revolution. It excludes Burke's aristocratic England. It casts a rather problematic light on America itself, in some of its sectors, and at a point in its history when it was strongly opposed to revolutionary France, which was engaged in abolishing slavery in the colonies. It ends up creating an opening for the October Revolution, which, with its appeal to the slaves of the colonies to rebel, seems to be aligned with the Black Jacobin, who was the protagonist of the San Domingo Revolution. These were the years when Sartre characterized Lumumba as a black Robespierre, and urged renovation and radicalization of the Jacobinism of Third World revolutionary movements in a socialist direction. The years when the Cuban Revolution drew attention to the revolution that had occurred almost 2 centuries earlier a short distance away, in San Domingo, so that the figure of Fidel Castro summoned up that of Toussaint Louverture. Numerous links seemed to connect Robespierre, Toussaint Louverture, Lenin, and anti-colonial movements, which sometimes referred both to the revolution led by the Black Jacobin and to the Bolshevik Revolution. They ended up identifying with these 2 revolutions that had occurred on the margins, or outside of, the West, in San Domingo and Russia, and the first inevitably referred back to France. In a sense, the expulsion of the Bolshevik Revolution from the West also required the expulsion of Jacobinism and the French Revolution as a whole. Arend registered this, now lamenting the regrettable fact that, quote, even revolutions on the American continent speak and act as though they knew by heart the texts of the revolutions in France, in Russia, and in China, but had never heard of such a thing as an American Revolution. End quote. Her 1963 book on revolution proposed to remedy this situation. It was not enough to assert the primacy of the Founding Fathers in the Western Revolution. The very category now seemed dubious or an encumbrance. According to Arendt, an, quote, Atlantic civilization did indeed exist in the 18th century. The glorious example of America had certainly influenced and encouraged the anti-feudal movement in Europe. At the very latest, however, it was shattered by the, quote, disastrous course of the French Revolution, that is, the emergence of Jacobinism. Certainly, quote, one is tempted to hope that the rift which occurred at the end of the 18th century is about to heal in the middle of the 20th century, when it has become rather obvious that Western civilization has its last chance of survival in an Atlantic community. End quote. Such a community was in fact being reconstructed on an entirely different basis from that envisaged by Palmer. Celebration of the American Revolution was now matched by utter condemnation of the French Revolution, regarded as the first stage in a disastrous process leading to the October Revolution and the Third World Revolutions, which threatened the very bases of, quote, Western civilization. Whereas in The Origins of Totalitarianism, the parabola leading to the Third Reich's barbarism was reconstructed from the prominence of counter-revolutionary literature and culture in Germany, and hence from the weakness of that country's revolutionary tradition. On Revolution claimed that, quote, freedom has been better preserved in countries where no revolution ever broke out. End quote. in the wake or on the model of the French, or where it had been defeated. Only now did a negative assessment of the October Revolution involve condemnation of the French Revolution as well. Liquidation of the thesis of the Western Revolution implied the expulsion from Atlantic civilization of a revolution that formed the start of a tradition issuing in the Bolshevik October and the other disastrous upheavals pervasive in the Third World at the time. The good revolution, bad revolution dichotomy no longer strictly coincided, as in Palmer, with the Western Revolution, Eastern Revolution dichotomy. It now involved contrasting the American Revolution, little space was devoted to Britain, with the revolutionary cycle from 1789 to 1917, and the ensuing anti-colonial movements, it being understood that the authentic West continued to coincide with the first term of the antithesis. At this point, Arendt's view did not differ significantly from that of Hayek or Thalmann, who well before her celebrated the excellence of English ideas, which were not only contrasted with the French Revolution, and, a fortiori, the Bolshevik, but stood out in splendid isolation in the liberal Western firmament. We have attended at some length to Arendt. An anti-fascist Jew exiled in the USA, she had looked with respect and sympathy on the USSR, which, in 1942, she credited with having, quote, patently eliminated anti-Semitism in the context of a just and very modern solution on the national question, end quote. Only via subsequent, laborious stages did she arrive at wholesale condemnation of the October Revolution and the French Revolution. Hers is an evolution that illuminates with a special clarity the radical mutation in the zeitgeist, with the transition from the anti-fascist Grand Alliance to the outbreak of the Cold War and the consequent development of a Western ideology commensurate with the new situation. This is a transition which, for chronological and biographical reasons, cannot be tracked with such clarity in any of the individual representatives of historical revisionism. When Alfred Coben, the author who initiated historical revisionism as regards the French Revolution, published Dictatorship in 1939, the anti-fascist coalition was not yet in existence. The non-aggression pact between Hitler and Stalin still obtained. And while he stressed that, quote, in a sense, all European dictators of the present day are children of the Communist Manifesto, the British historian was concerned to formulate a balanced judgment of Robespierre, explaining the terror on the basis of the concrete situation imposed by the war, and sometimes providing a respectful, if not sympathetic, image of the Jacobin leader. Quote, he fell not because he was a tyrant, but because he was not sufficiently tyrannical. End quote. Instead, it was Marat who was, quote, potentially the first dictator of modern Europe, and Marx and Engels were the political heirs, not of Robespierre, but of Marat. End quote. As we can see, condemnation of the Bolshevik October and Marxism did not as yet involve liquidation of Jacobinism as such. Subsequently, we witness a hardening of judgments. But this is not the key point. The isolation of the Bolshevik Revolution was accentuated by a different strategy, that is, by highlighting the weak points in the Marxist interpretation of the French Revolution as a bourgeois revolution, so as to radically challenge it. In Coben's view, it involved a teleological type of interpretation which, in terms of the philosophy of history, seemed to contain implicit justification of the Bolshevik Revolution as a proletarian revolution. But while it delegitimizes October 1917, liquidation of the category of bourgeois revolution suspends the French Revolution itself in a vacuum, for it now lacks an objective material basis, and is in fact all the more inexplicable given that supersession of the Ancien Regime had already been accomplished prior to 1789, or was at an advanced stage at any rate. Jacobin radicalism was no longer, could no longer be, in Marxist terms, the plebeian mode in which the revolutionary bourgeoisie dealt with its enemies. Instead, according to Furet, it was an example of dérapage, derailment from the normal reformist logic peculiar to American and English revolutions. In France, ideology had battened onto itself, losing any contact with reality. It was ideological delirium that had generated the terror, and, more than a century later, the Gulag. Albeit in a different sequence and in a different way, in European historiography and culture, as in its American counterpart, the isolation of the Bolshevik Revolution resulted in the liquidation of Jacobinism and the French Revolution as a whole. In analyzing the Gulag, Furet frequently refers to the origins of totalitarianism, but without noticing that it contains a positive evaluation of Jacobinism, and, at least in part, of the October Revolution. Likewise ignored or repressed is the fact that the parabola culminating in totalitarianism commences with the negation of the concept of man as such formulated by Burke, to whom Furet constantly refers. The latter takes no account of Arendt's indictment of colonial domination, perceived in her work as the laboratory in which the constitutive elements of the univers concertinaire were assembled. The triumph of historical revisionism yields a compact, unnuanced ideology that places Jacobinism and Bolshevism exclusively in the dock. End section.